Culminators, thank you for joining us today. Aaron Sibarium. Aaron, very simple name. Sibarium, never heard a name like that before. He's going to explain to us what the hell kind of name he thinks it is. He's an American. He's not sensitive about that. I don't ask me what kind of name Coleman is. Anyway, Aaron is a writer, writes for the Free Beacon. His beat is our beat. He talks a lot about and writes a lot about, researches issues of free speech and campus culture, cancel culture, with some certain amount of focus, I think, on what's going on campuses where our future is being destroyed right now. And Aaron, you're out of college, what, about 15 minutes? Or did you even graduate from Yale?
Yeah, so I graduated in 2018.
Okay, all right, so that's already 4 whole years, but you could have gone twice by now.
Yeah, which is hard for me to believe.
Well, but you wrote for the daily the Yale Daily News, or were you the editor?
So I wrote opinion columns for it, and I also was the opinion editor of it for a year. And the year that I was an editor was the same year that Nicholas Christakis was encircled in the Silliman courtyard, and Yale had all sorts of struggle sessions, and they changed the name of Calhoun College, all of that. So for people who are familiar with the whole Halloween costume Christakis affair, I was basically, there and having to edit opinion columns about it while it was going on, which was sort of my first exposure to the real kind of, beating heart of campus leftism.
Why don't you tell us about it? I will tell you that I ask people to tell what their followers inevitably already know is the backstory, but it's a big old world out there, and a lot of culminators are closer to my age than to yours, and they might not necessarily be on top. Now, in our house, we talk about cancel culture and college, especially as it affects colleges, all day and all night, 7 days a week. But you thought you were having a normal life, and you thought you were having this great time being the opinion editor. Well, when you were the opinion editor for the Yale Daily, were you politically conservative at the time?
Not really. So I came into college a pretty moderate Democrat. I think for a while, even when I was in high school, I kind of had an inkling of what, I guess back then we called it political correctness, what that was, and that it was bad. But I also thought, yeah, Barack Obama, right about most things. Republicans, wrong about most things. I know whose side I'm on, et cetera, et cetera. And I came into college, and I remember this very vividly. They have all these debating societies at Yale. And since I was a Democrat, I thought, oh, I'll go to the party of the left. That'll be the right fit for me, right? Well, the first debate they were having was resolved, abolish the police. And I saw that and thought, well, that's stupid. Like, no one's ever going to take something like that seriously, right?
Especially in New Haven.
Yeah, especially in New Haven.
Not especially. I mean, there are harsher places on God's green earth, but
yeah. So, and then, the Conservative Party was debating something cool, like, resolve that Socrates deserved to die. So I thought, oh, I'll go hang out with those guys, because that's a cooler debate. But so, right from the start, I kind of was like, I thought I was on the left, but these left-wing people believe very strange, crazy things.
Where did you grow up, Aaron?
I grew up in Chevy Chase, Maryland. So, and my dad is a lawyer. Yeah, my dad is like a Jewish lawyer in DC. I mean, I have no reason to be reactionary based on sort of my background. But yeah, so I got some inklings of it my freshman year at Yale that, wow, the left means something very different here. And then in 2015, I mean, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but basically the nuts and bolts of it is a woman sent an administrator sent a very anodyne email saying that if you're offended by Halloween costumes, you should talk to each other and not expect the administration to police Halloween costumes. this was seen as a horrible act of racism and,
or at least a
violence.
provocation. At the very
Yeah,
least, a
yeah,
provocation. How
yeah,
dare you
and
suggest? How dare you suggest that we young adults handle this in a manner that might befit
right.
adults?
Right. So then there was, her husband, who was like the head of one of the dorms, residential colleges, ends up getting encircled in the courtyard, and all these activists shout at him for like an hour, and there's video of it. And then there's all sorts of protests going on, and the narrative quickly becomes Yale is a systemically racist institution. That needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, basically. And of course, the president of Yale University does not dismiss all this as the absurdity that it is, but instead validates it and says, "Oh, I'm so touched by your outpouring of emotion, blah 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 blah."
So my question for you, Aaron, is: you mentioned that you made a point of mentioning that the president at Yale, basically folded immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Did you begin at that time to know? Was that what you expected would happen? Did you think there's gonna be some pushback? Where the students, they're the
In retrospect, it seems obvious he would fold. I think at the time, I don't even know if I was a little surprised, because in my freshman year, his kind of opening address to all the new students was about the importance of free speech. And then, of course, with this, he tries to claim, oh, well, we haven't silenced anyone, so this is, and protest is free speech, so this is actually a actualization of the values I talked about, which was, of course, bullshit, because the ideology that was ascendant was one that saw acts of free speech as violence, right? And he was essentially endorsing these protests that were predicated on this assumption. So that was silly. But yeah, I mean, I was a little struck by what I really wasn't expecting more than anything about just how he responded, was just how rapidly the campus climate would change, right? I would say in 2014, it was a pretty open place. I mean, you had kids who got triggered by little things and would whine on social media, but just most people didn't really care. And then all these protests happened, and I would say for at least a year or two afterwards, really everyone was walking on eggshells, and there was a palpable change. And I know people who, I think, before the protests, were pretty comfortable about speaking their mind, then afterwards would tell me, I can't write anything, I can't say anything, I'm scared. So that was kind of my first real exposure to how Orwellian it can get. And that didn't change my politics, or my policy views maybe on the economy overnight, but
you
it
were not yet
definitely.
but you were not yet the editorial page editor.
No, I was, while this
You
was all
were.
going on.
So that's
Yeah. And so like a dynamic I had to deal with was, some people would come in with, just for one, I mean, just horribly written op-eds, complaining about systemic racism, and I'd have to edit them and pretend that they were not horrible. Which is fine. I mean, it's good practice at being professional with people you disagree with. But also I would like try to get people to write op-eds attacking this stuff, and I managed to get a few, but it was tough to find, because very few people wanted to put their name on anything. Especially, I mean, some people would say things like, "Well, it's important to listen to all sides," but what it took me a while to get. I did get someone to write this eventually, and I remember it vividly because I was so happy I could get it. Was someone who would just say, not just free speech is good, but the substantive worldview being advanced by these kids is bad. It is dangerous and toxic, and will be the death of the university as we know it. And nobody wanted to say that, even though it was just obviously true, right? To the extent people would criticize it, it would always be on these kind of narrow procedural free speech grounds. And yes, I mean, free speech is important, but also, for one, you're not going to have free speech if kind of these sorts of premises seep through and saturate the culture. But for another thing, even putting free speech aside, just the whole worldview about racism pervading everything, and everything being white supremacy. I mean, it's just wrong. And if you try to run a society on it, you're gonna have problems.
So the free speech issue, was that the lever that began to get you to re-examine all your political assumptions?
Yeah, that was a lot of it. I mean, and the other thing I'll say is, like, even to this day, right? If you ask me what's the best healthcare system or what's sort of the optimal tax policy, there's all sorts of discrete issues where I don't have strong views, and in fact, probably might lean towards Democrats if, like, you pushed me. But I would say that I've really come to realize that a lot of the stuff people think of as just those crazy college kids is in fact very deeply institutionalized in now, not just on campuses, but in the media, um, in NGOs, in culture, and in particular in certain sort of professional bureaucracies that actually exert power over people's lives. And now I would argue is in fact, kind of has been institutionalized in various ways within the federal government. And some of those operations of power are kind of vague and shadowy and are hard to see. But a lot of what I've tried to do, in addition to reporting on just the campus craziness, is show how actually these views do have concrete policy implications and do in fact turn into policies. I mean, the textbook example I always go to is all the states and medical agencies that rationed vaccines and monoclonal antibodies for COVID based on race, which just, I think if you told someone 10 years ago we would be doing that, they'd say, well, come on, that's absurd. No one on the left really believes in doing this. But now it's like listed as a medical best practice pretty much on HHS's website, right? And multiple states, including Utah, which is not no one would consider a sort of bastion of liberalism, but Utah did this, right? So it's actually gone extremely far. And in many ways, I mean, I think that's really the deeper issue. Like, yes, free speech matters, it's important, but there's also a whole bunch of just like substantive policy questions that have now kind of without the public noticing been decided in favor of a really pretty radical ideology.
So now you're writing for the Free Beacon. Did you land there right after college?
After college, I worked at a place called the American Interest, which now no longer exists, although there's kind of a successor magazine to it. And it was a good place to work after college. I mean, it was like a very sort of intellectual centrist publication started by Frank Fukuyama in the early 2000s. Kind of originally, the project was kind of to rescue neoconservatism from the neoconservatives. It was sort of born by people who were broadly sympathetic to the neoconservative worldview, but thought that Iraq had gone wrong. I would say eventually it kind of turned into something a little different, but it was a pretty centrist publication, anti-Trump, but also anti-woke. And then I went over to the Free Beacon, edited there for a little bit, and then pretty quickly decided to start doing reporting full time. So that's basically how I got to where I
am. Have your views on Donald Trump evolved?
Not that much. I mean, I still think that he made some important interventions into the discourse and had some positive effects. I, when he was first running, thought this guy does not seem temperamentally fit to be president, and I don't really want to see him on the desk of the Oval Office. And by the end of it, and in particular after January 6th, I was like, yeah, I think my intuition was basically right. This was not good. And while not entirely foreseeable. It was not exactly surprising that something like this happened. So, no, I'm not a Trump fan. I think for every good thing he did, he also set in motion a lot of bad things that I don't like. I also, my biggest concern about him, frankly, is not that he was or is going to usher in some kind of American fascism. I don't really see that happening. The concern is that he just sort of breaks down lots of norms and guardrails and then provokes such a reaction on the other side that we just get into this sort of iterative death spiral where both sides continue to break norms in response to the other, and eventually just all the kind of unspoken assumptions on which, like modern American, democracy rests kind of go away. And then, I actually think it's probably more likely that if we got some sort of totalitarian regime out of this, it would be more kind of a woke, soft totalitarianism with just fewer guardrails. But ultimately, look, something doesn't have to be anything like fascism or dictatorship to be bad, right? There's lots of Latin American countries that are just sort of banana republics and have low quality governance and political instability, et cetera. And you can have a lot of that without it really being dictatorship, right? So I don't really see like the dark resistance prophecies of Trumpian fascism coming true, but so many other bad things could happen that, I mean, yeah, I'm still pretty opposed to Trump. The thing, here's where I would say I've changed. I probably went into college being like, I would only vote for like, a super moderate Republican, maybe. And now, I mean, let's just say, I would very much enjoy watching a DeSantis presidency. And my issues with Trump really have more to do with sort of him personally and my worries about him being fit for office than with like, some people are like, oh my God, and he's un-American because he supports industrial policy. I mean, no, that's like not a good argument against Trump. I mean, even if you do oppose industrial policy, that's like not a big deal. So I mean, at this point, I'm like, I would like there to be someone in the Oval Office who understands wokeness is bad and also like uses his office to fight it.
Or uses it efficaciously.
Yes, and that's the other thing. I think Trump put some things on the table that were good, but I don't think he actually, especially on the woke stuff, he did that one executive order banning like CRT trainings in the government, which then got immediately reversed, right? Like if he had done that the day he took office, it might have had more of an effect, but he just did it at the last minute at the end of his presidency. It just, didn't do that much.
Now, do you think, you mentioned something you said in a second ago sparked a question for me, which was, is there a middle anymore? Do you think, people are always talking about swing votes, and we both know Twitter is not real life. But nonetheless, experiencing life as we do and reading those annual, columns on how to interact or how to not interact with your awful, terrible, horrible right-wing family. Do you think there is a middle anymore, or is that matters? That the people, are there people who really need to have their minds made up between Democrat and Republican candidates, as opposed to people just being dum-dums? I think there's a difference. Do you agree with me that there's a difference?
Well, yeah, no, definitely. I mean, look, empirically, there obviously are swing voters. I do think there are a lot of people in the middle, and there certainly are a lot of people, and you see this even at the elite level, who feel politically homeless, right? People like, I guess I would put Barry Weiss maybe in this category, who maybe a few years ago would have been just a sort of normal liberal, and now it's like, she's not really a conservative, but she's also not really welcome on the left. I mean that is a growing phenomenon, and I think there are a lot of people who feel quite a bit of, Yeah, I mean,
That,
he's a little more his politics, I think, are a little more exotic than Barry's. But yes, I mean, no, he's I mean, a lot of these guys, the it's not totally clear where they fall.
well, I mean, to me, it's interesting watching
But
a number of them. They can't let go of their old identities.
yeah. I mean, I think that's right. And I think well, I mean, Glenn Greenwald actually, I think,
He no, he no, he's whatever he is. I don't think
yeah,
he's afraid of anything. He's never been afraid of
right.
anything.
Yeah.
And I mean, I saw him at Freedom Fest in July. I mean, I
Hmm.
said to myself, Glenn Green. I mean, he was speaking fine, but Glenn Greenwald is here at Freedom Fest. I mean, this guy
Yeah.
was such a bomb throwing lefty in the day, but there's no question that a lot of people who have the some degree of intellectual honesty
Mm.
have either had to decide, do I have any or do I have none? I mean, in that respect, there's very little middle because you've got to.
Yeah. I mean, I think, part of this too, there is, I wouldn't call them dum-dums, but there's also, I think there are a
Unsophisticated.
lot of, well, there's a lot of people who it's not even that they're unsophisticated. It's that, like, they just don't have that much time, and they have jobs and they read the New York Times, which presents a certain narrative, right? And I think there's a lot of Democrats who, if they really knew and understood what some segments of the left, maybe not so much the Democratic Party per se, but certainly what the kind of bureaucracies that are aligned with the Democratic Party are doing, like this, race-based medicine stuff. I mean, I think they probably think, "Whoa, holy shit, that's kind of crazy." But it's really it can be very hard to break through, to just normie people who think that they have their tribe, etc. Especially if they're not really already following this stuff closely. So I've definitely had conversations with people where or heard about conversations where someone says, well, like they're literally denying like white people medical care, and of course then it's like that's just what Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump say. And it's like, well, no, I have the document like right here. I mean, here's how many points they give for being non-white, and it's like substantial. And white people are the only ones who don't get these points. Like, this is just the definition. I mean, I know you're not supposed to say anti-white racism or anti-white discrimination, but I don't know what else you call it, right? That's just the most sort of parsimonious term for what's going on. Uh, and I mean, I think a lot of people either just can't believe it, or they say, "Oh, that must be disinformation," because they're so kind of ensconced in this media echo chamber that they don't really see it. And what does tend to wake people up, it seems, is when the insanity starts to actually materially affect their lives. So, with crime, like, you are, I think, starting to see some people say, wait a minute, it was kind of okay for a few months in 2020 when we were all tired of being in lockdown and we wanted to protest racial justice, blah, blah, blah. 2 years later, even really people in deep blue San Francisco are like, maybe we shouldn't be allowing people to just defecate in the streets. That's not great, right? But it really, it's, you have to be canceled. You have to know someone who's canceled. You have to experience the costs of sort of the racially inflected woke politics, to start really asking yourself the questions that would lead you to maybe realize, oh wow, there's a lot of crap in these bureaucracies I didn't know about. So,
Right. I
and
mean, in Idaho, you mentioned before, if the fact that you have these medical racialist, let's call it,
yeah,
policies.
Utah.
Oh, Utah. I'm
Utah,
sorry.
yeah.
So right,
Yeah.
right.
Even
So
crazier, yeah.
so it's not because the people have voted for that. They just have
No.
no clue or control over what professional
Right.
bureaucrats are doing in their name.
Yeah, correct. Now, granted, I mean, that proposal, I don't know if he technically officially signed off on it, but it looks like that in Utah more or less had the approval of the Republican governor. So in theory, right? I mean, I'm not optimistic this will happen, but someone could challenge him in an election and say, this Republican governor kind of let the bureaucracy do this with sort of a wink, wink, and we're not gonna stand for that, rhino nonsense or whatever, right? Someone could do that, but yeah, in general, the prime movers are the bureaucracies. It's not like the Republican governor of Utah came up with the idea to do anti-white racial discrimination in medicine. I mean, that was hatched really at like a hospital network and in the Utah Public Health Department. And I would note too, this is the other thing that can be tough, is that they themselves don't even often, I think, realize that that's what they're doing, right? Like they all saw it, because I did a story on this where I sort of went through their emails that I got through a FOIA. It's very clear they just thought about it in terms of, well, people of certain groups are dying more of COVID, so the utilitarian thing to do is just to give them preference, which, like, when you phrase it at that high a level of generality, doesn't sound crazy. And you could say, well, but like we gave preference to old people. What's the difference? Well, I mean, the difference is that old people actually are, that's a much better predictor of COVID mortality than race. And also, this shouldn't need to be said, but like race is a kind of inflammatory basis for allocating any good or service in a way that age just isn't, given the history and demographic composition of the United States. And like, you don't really hear about societies torn apart by like age discrimination or generational, but I mean, well, maybe there's a way you can kind of read some, certain histories of Weimar Germany as actually being like a kind of generational, but okay, fine. But like in general, right,
it's a little
when
more
societies
attenuated.
implode, yeah, it's ethnic and racial conflict, right? That's what blows up societies, not like boomers and Gen Z hating each other. So I think yeah, like there's a lot of these folks, the race consciousness is just so ingrained into kind of the received wisdom of public health, for example, that they don't even realize fully what they're doing. It's just, I'm reminded a bit of the banality of evil concept in Hannah Arendt, right? I truly, I'm sure there are some like really crazy people, but I think a lot of them are kind of working on autopilot and genuinely don't get what's going on until, I report a piece on it and then Tucker Carlson picks it up and then they start getting all these, phone calls slamming them for, anti-white racism. And then of course, suddenly the policy goes away. Because they get new data, 2 weeks after the story that makes them look really bad, which suddenly justifies revoking the discrimination.
Well, I mean, that's it. Because you mentioned that I'm looking at your Twitter feed, and ABA, basically, the American Bar Association, basically put their toe in or their foot in that water and said, experienced the pushback and concluded this is what was the water that they had proposed.
Yeah,
basically race, norming law school classes to require law schools to diversify their student bodies. How would that have been different from affirmative action?
Well, so the reason it was controversial initially was that, well, the American Bar Association accredits basically every law school in the United States. So you gotta do what the American Bar Association tells you to do. And obviously law schools already practice affirmative action. So this proposal effectively would have been telling them, you've got to practice even more affirmative action to sort of, make progress in being even more diverse, right? So it just would have amplified it. And, there was a line in the initial version of the proposal which said that anti-discrimination laws would not be considered a justification for not complying with the accreditation standard. So then these Yale law professors just basically said, well, you're basically telling schools that they need to violate federal law to retain their certification. That's insane. You're a law school accrediting body. You're supposed to care what the law says. What the hell? And so then they revised it and got rid of that language. But still like they were going to have them, I think, have to submit basically like data progress reports on how much diversity they had to their accreditor. And I mean, that's obviously going to create pressure to do all sorts of racial balancing, potentially beyond what federal law allows. I mean, I'm skeptical that the alleged constraints on racial balancing under the current affirmative action regime actually do very much to constrain it. But still, this would have really like, tested the waters. So it's not clear to me how much of their revoking this standard had to do with the kind of pushback that it would make them violate the law versus kind of almost internal woke pushback, where some people said, oh, it doesn't go far enough because it focuses too much on race and not enough on like LGBTQ and disability, which was another thing people said. So, who knows what really made the difference. But nonetheless, it wouldn't be the only case in which one of these bureaucracies does fold under enough kind of concerted pressure. The key is generating the pressure, both through reporting and I think through threat of lawsuits in some cases. And that's hard to do because like a lot of what happens in these institutions, it's especially true at universities, but not only there, is that they're on the hook for civil rights violations, right? What civil rights law does is it says even things done by private actors, alleged discrimination or hostile environment by private actors, that's the government's business, and you're liable if you allow any of this to happen. But a private university is not bound by the First Amendment, so there's this huge kind of imbalance of power where they're sort of an incentive structure where they are on the hook for allowing any kind of discrimination or harassment, however that's defined, but they're not on the hook for violating anyone's free speech. And that's true of a lot of corporations, right? And other institutions. They are on the hook for allowing harassment, and they are not on the hook for censoring their employees. So because of this incentive asymmetry, you've seen this corresponding kind of imbalance of bureaucratic power within all the institutions where they set up these they initially, right, they had these compliance departments to comply with civil rights law, which made sense. And then, of course, those departments develop their own kind of incentives to keep perpetuating themselves. And they kind of grow into the DEI offices, which have to find constant instances of racism and sexism to expunge, or they don't have a job. They can't justify their own existence. But because there's no like punishment for, like just violating people's free speech or doing all sorts of these other crazy things, there's not really an incentive for there to be like a bureaucracy that protects free speech or that sort of prosecutes free speech violations. So what you end up with is, even if a university claims it has both, discrimination protections and robust free speech protections, it's only the discrimination protections that have an entire enforcement bureaucracy behind them. So it's not surprising, right, that universities end up erring on the side of preventing discrimination rather than on protecting free speech.
Well, have you ever written an article about this?
Yeah, I did in the wake of kind of this basic concept I talked about in an article in the wake of the initial Yale Law School, the thing about the trap house email. So for people who don't know, this kid sent a pretty anodyne email inviting students to his trap house, like for a party. And then all these kids complained that was racist. And the DEI bureaucrats called him in for a struggle session, which we got audio of, which was really crazy. And a lot of people were like, "This is insane," because they made these veiled threats that if he didn't apologize for this anodyne email, that they would like punish his they could get him in trouble with the bar's character and fitness section, right? So they basically were threatening his career over a totally anodyne email, right? And so in the wake of that, I wrote a piece where I talked to some law professors and academic freedom folks, and they said, that this is a problem, right? Like we have this bureaucracy dedicated to, protect, fighting harassment, which in practice basically means dedicated to regulating speech, and we don't have any bureaucracy dedicated to protecting free speech. And I think that's basically the norm at a lot of institutions.
That's a fascinating point.
Yeah.
I think you quote Robert George, good old Robert George. Yeah, I mean, I guess you do talk about that there, but I mean, I invite you, I would urge you to really do something specifically on that topic, because you're bringing together two phenomena, and it explains the juxtaposition of those two, and the asymmetry there raise really interesting issues that I never, I think I had, in fact, I even remember having that in the back of my head. Maybe it was during another interview where somehow the issue came up. Well, that's not free speech. That's, that's the, the woke stuff. There is, and Robert George, of course, thought he had put into place at Princeton, or had helped give birth to, a policy at Princeton that reaffirmed the Chicago principles, and, pursuant to which that university, my alma mater, would guard free speech, and that it would be an imperative of policy of Princeton. And he and those who shared his views got absolutely sandbagged, or was more like a bait and switch. I mean, about the dean, the president there, just awful, absolutely awful. They did to Joshua Katz.
No, no, I agree. That's a function of the same incentive problem, right? Now, granted, that one also, and this is related, that there was also all this sort of media attention, and I think it's not just the bureaucracy. It's that it's the bureaucratic asymmetry coupled with a sort of media that aggressively reports on any alleged instance of sexual impropriety.
Well, you made an important point about the ABA being the accrediting body,
right,
for law schools in the country. I think part of the reason that they backed down was there are a million ways someone might use a policy that is premised on violating federal law as an attack on their ability or right or appropriateness as an accrediting body. And that's incredibly important to them. I mean, they're ABA, which I have not been a member of in 25 years, is a lobby. It's not like a guild, or it's not like in bars with unitary bars where you have to be a member of the American Bar Association to be an American lawyer. No relation at all. They have policies, they have politics, and they have things that they advocate for. That doesn't exist in universities except the smaller ones. Yale and Princeton, with multi-billion-dollar endowments, are no longer feeling any pain. Their administrators have no financial incentive to worry about crusty old conservative alumni. Those are mostly dead or already donating somewhere else. They need the money coming in from the progressive alumni who are their bread and butter.
Yeah, and frankly, I think they even do. I mean, some of them still do get donations from conservative alums who have essentially acknowledged that the universities are horrible, but delude themselves into thinking, well, it's just that the Eisgruber, the Princeton president, he's bad, but the next president will be better. No. This is not about any one person. This is about an entire system, right? And I think, probably even if the conservative donors all stopped giving, it wouldn't make a difference. But they won't even stop giving, which is another thing that really frustrates me. I'm like, why the hell would you? I mean, look, I don't have a ton of money, but like, just on principle anyway, even if I did, like, I'm not going to give a cent to Yale, because it just, they need to feel as much pain as possible. And look, this is the other thing I'll say. I would like it. I joked about this, that, DeSantis, if he's president, should do like an FBI raid of a different university
I
every
saw that.
week. And it's like, I mean, I'm kind of kidding, but like they really, you got to make these things, make them feel some pain, right? So like, taxing their endowments, there's all sorts of things that I think could be done, or at least put on the table. That would be good.
Well, I mean,
And
I think I think there's a parallel with universities and tech companies and many other institutions, NGOs, that they are private institutions, and all of a sudden the left is enamored of the liberties of private institutions, and many on the right, including people who have been or had been libertarians, are realizing, I wish I had that meme with the guys in prison that says I've made a terrible mistake. Trusting this idea that, well, we can trust the market, we could, and very few libertarians wanted to hear about the threat from corporate governance.
yeah,
So-called nonprofits like universities have the same exact incentives as for-profit institutions. Neither one of them is concerned about profit, because woke BlackRock doesn't care about its profits, it cares about its agendas. I mean, they're controlling so much money
right.
that people who invest in their funds are being ignored. I mean, there's already litigation over that.
Yeah, I saw this, but well, right. It's also, it's diminishing marginal returns, right? As you get, once you're past a certain level of material comfort, you're kind of liberated to worry about non-material things. And so, in order to really reverse that, you'd have to really just make these institutions a lot poorer, and that may not be possible. But the other thing I'll say is, like, with Princeton, right, they get all this sort of media attention and student protests that probably, I think, pushed them to discipline and then eventually, fire Joshua Katz. But you also it can go in the other direction, as the ABA thing shows, right? And I think that's the other thing. Like, what one reason I like my job is that I actually, it's not enough on its own, but I do think that it is possible for sort of conservative, or if you like, just kind of heterodox media to really up the pressure on these institutions. But you can't do that by like just writing sort of philosophical essays about why free speech is good and why Alan Bloom was right, the universities are lost. No. What you have to do is just go and show people, here's what's going on, right? And here are the facts. And like, here's President, Christopher Eisgruber's email, go tell him what you think. Like, and that's kind of, I mean, I do think that sort of thing can actually work. Because like Yale Law School, for example, you saw after I published some stories on the insanity that's been going on there, they did start issuing statements being like, oh, that was protected speech, we would never blah blah blah, and doing damage control, right? And even
David Latt, who was a very
yep.
influential alumnus among people who are not part of the international global conspiracy, he had an open letter also. I mean, the thing about Yale alumni, unlike almost any other school except maybe Harvard, but even then Harvard is so big that, I mean, who isn't a Harvard law school? I didn't get into Harvard Law School, but all the movers and shakers who aren't Yale Law School graduates are Harvard Law School graduates.
Right.
But
right.
Yale is a much more select club and much more of an elite. Like, in other words, when those people complain, and when someone like you from the Yale community, and having been a Yale Daily News op-ed editor, it gets heard. It gets heard. I do think, though, again, the analogy to the ABA is not so good, because the ABA has to worry about its accreditation.
Yeah.
It's harder to ask. It's harder to see what Yale has to worry about. Also, there are very few parents who, if they have the chance to send their children to Yale, notwithstanding the cost, will say, listen, this looks like an absolute clown show, but
Yeah.
Bunny, do you think you can hold your breath and keep your mouth shut for 4 years, because your life will be perfect after you graduate from
Yeah, I
Yale,
know.
right?
That's the problem. I mean, I also think another thing is to the extent that government policies have kind of exacerbated the credentialism, crisis in our country, that's another area that we need a smart, competent Republican to work on, right? Like it the reality is that I think college is mostly signaling, I mean, yes, like Yale, there are network effects and there is certainly value to going to that school. But the truth is that, the people who get into Yale are generally people who would be fine even if they didn't get into Yale, because they're smart and ambitious and hardworking. And those things do matter to some extent in the
And often
market.
already decently well connected.
Yes, exactly. And so, one thing that could be done is, look, I think that the credentialism is a huge problem, and there's a lot of jobs that require college degrees that shouldn't. And frankly, now you have people like Peter Thiel. He has that fellowship where basically he pays you a bunch of money to drop out of college, right? And do other stuff. And to be honest, I think like more of that is good, because especially if you're interested in something like tech or finance, my real sense is that your like computer science classes in college are probably not gonna make or break your success. I just that my again, I don't know, this isn't my world, but from what I hear, that's just people who think that it like matters whether you take, Harvard's like graduate computer science class or not. This is not the way that like, it's not like Facebook is like some super complicated, algorithm that requires like a PhD in theoretical mathematics to create. Like that's not why Mark Zuckerberg was successful. It was other stuff, right? And I think, and so yeah, look, I think to the extent that we can find ways of undermining kind of the tyranny of credentialism, we should. And you mentioned the ABA. I'd add one more thing. It's the only recognized law school accreditor by the U.S. Department of Education. My understanding is that there is nothing to stop a Secretary of Education in the next Republican administration, from just basically saying, we're not going to recognize you, and thus, will not make law schools, like no law school will be accredited by you, will be eligible for federal funds, unless of course you show that you really are like a good accrediting body and are not just a woke advocacy group. Like they could threaten, because they could overnight revoke their recognition by the Department of Education. And I mean, they wouldn't have to do it. They just make a credible threat, and then the ABA would probably stop being woke. Yeah, I mean, so it's not like there's nothing you could do. I mean, now of course there'd be this whole media firestorm about how Ron DeSantis was politicizing accreditation, blah blah blah. And I think the response to that would be, look, guys, look at what the ABA has already done. Like the idea that it's not already a like woke political body that's effectively just an extension of the democratic machine is a fantasy and absurd. And and fundamentally, it is a political question what we're going to recognize as what the political bodies of the United States will recognize, right? So just lean into the politics and say, yes, this is a political question, and we're doing politics, and suck it up. Like either get in line or we're going to punish you. And I don't see any problem with doing that. And I think that if we got someone in power who was interested, yeah, like that could potentially make a big difference. Or just hell, the American Medical Association, the medical school accreditors are also insane. It's like you don't even have to like make the explicit threat. You just like do a congressional subpoena, like haul them in front of like a bunch of senators and just have them be grilled for like an hour in a really embarrassing hearing. And like I bet they would probably back off from some of the crazy stuff, right? These people do not like publicity. The wokeness tends to advance in the shadows. And they're not good, I think, at defending a lot of this crap, in part because it's so deeply institutionalized that they don't even they haven't had to think about defending it. So, you can definitely, I'm not necessarily optimistic in the short run, but there's tons and tons of things that you could do to fight back against this stuff, which would not involve violating the law or, riding roughshod over some really cherished democratic norm. It would just be, normal politics, right? Exercising powers that are already like, already exist within the government for perfectly legitimate ends. I think it actually is possible to use the political process to fight back against some of this stuff.
Political and free speech. I mean, you're obviously making good use of it.
Yes.
And Aaron, you are leaning into it big time. You seem like you've got a lot of creative ideas, and I bet you're open to growing and observing and watching things as they develop. Anything special coming up? Has anyone got you writing books yet? Is any speaking tours? Anything you want to pitch?
Not
just
the main thing I'll pitch.
Read his
articles. Yeah, the main thing I'll pitch, but beyond just read my stuff, but also I co-host a podcast with Charles Lehman at the Manhattan Institute called Institutionalized, where we talk about various American institutions and why they've gone crazy. And a lot of it is looking at kind of incentive structures and bureaucratic logics that create a lot of the woke stuff. We sort of try to go beyond just complaining about the ideology or adopting these hand-wavy cultural explanations and really get into some sort of more concrete material analysis. And we've done over 20 episodes. And yeah, I think if you liked the way that I sort of analyzed the problems in this episode, you should check out my podcast, because that's generally how we analyze problems through the lens of institutions.
Very, very interesting. I think I will. I mean, I'm not known for listening to podcasts. It's one of my running jokes. I don't have the patience, but it seems like you've got an interesting couple of takes here, and I like your title. It seems to allude to a punk rock song from my days of college DJ. Am I onto something? All I wanted was a Pepsi.
We were. Yeah, I think Charles may have had that in mind. It's also it's a double entendre, right? Institutionalized, because we're talking about institutionalization, as in things get institutionalized within institutions, but also institutionalized. It sounds like crazy, and like our institutions are crazy. They deserve to be institutionalized in various ways.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. More important to listen to the podcast, more important to listen to this podcast as well. Aaron, thank you very much for coming on. It really has been fascinating listening to you, and I'm looking forward to more dialogue with you, as they say, and you're a guy to watch. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.